Profit advocacy organization powering queer political action across Canada. Fae is an award-winning activist, a sought-after public speaker, and frequent voice on queer and progressive issues in Canadian media. She was once on a chocolate bar. She lives rent-free in the rotted brains of the far right, and is driven by a simple desire to build a more free, equal, and socially just Canada, one conversation and campaign at a time. Welcome, Fae.
Thank you. I'll give you a hug. Right? Trying to come up with a bio that is like the right amount of like funny but also sometimes serious is so difficult. Yeah. How are you all doing this morning? Yeah. I was sitting there and I was like, I don't need to talk. We can just let Henry come and share wisdom with us and like, I'm good. Like I can just like bask in that. Where is Henry? Thank you, Henry. That was so lovely to hear and listen to. Folks, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here today. And I've been to PEI every year for the last 3 years. So I have visited many a time. And I was born in Fredericton, so I have East Coast street cred. And I do live in Halifax now, though that happened in September. So I don't know if I can call myself a Haligonian, which is almost as hard to pronounce as Saskatchewanian. But I am from this part of the country-ish. I also feel like every time I'm on the island, I get the warmest welcome. I had some travel chaos yesterday, a flight that was maybe booked and maybe not booked, and so I hopped on a bus and did the like maritime adventure, and then every time I get here, I end up like the first night, I was at like the most lovely little dinner with Josie, and I was like, this is like the best way to be greeted to the island. I think there is the term island hospitality, and y'all deliver. So give yourselves a big gay round of applause. So my approach to talks like this is not to stand behind a podium and give a traditional lecture. I love to be in conversation with an audience. There's also a lot of you and just one of me. So we're gonna like take it as we can. But my hope really is to paint a picture. I have the honor, privilege, pleasure, and nightmare role of traveling across this country, trying to help queer and trans Canadians, communities, allies, and friends respond to a really terrifying tidal shift. I have been in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where governments are quite literally stripping away the rights of trans young people and their families. I have seen the fear in a mom's eyes as she wonders if the province that she knows and loves is going to still be safe for her child. I have heard from those kids themselves, who yes, are scared of the icky and angry and hateful policies, but are more scared that those policies give permission to the playground bullies to lean in and treat queer kids like any queer person in this room is used to being treated. And that is not in a good way. And so I'm going to try not to make you more depressed. But I do have a tendency of giving the ringing the alarm bell, painting the picture of what's at stake. But there is an undertone of humor and of hope that will hopefully get us through some of that doom and gloom. Does that make sense? Okay, I will try not to make anyone need the lovely support folks that we have in the back of the room through this conversation. So the way that I'm going to structure this is I'm going to start with that broad strokes picture. What's going on and why should it matter to you, whether you're queer or trans, marginalized in some other way, or if you're just somebody who happens to believe in human rights and freedom. And then we'll go from there into what do we do about it? How do we respond in this new era when the playbook being used against us by far-right groups, by neo-Nazis, by white supremacists, by the whole range of icky and not particularly friendly to us, how do we adapt to that moment? And how do we organize to win and organize to build a better future for queer and trans people and indeed for everyone? Before I get too far, I know there was a land acknowledgement read, but I like to connect the dots there myself as well. So I live in Halifax, Chipuktuk, Mi'kma'ki. I spent most of my adult life on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin, Anishinaabe territory, colonially known as Ottawa. And I think one of the struggles we have in 2025 is that despite our dialogue and language around intersectionality, around standing in solidarity with others, we still think of these issues in discrete corners, in different buckets, and we don't always see the connection between them. When I think about homophobia and transphobia on these lands, I cannot think about them without connecting the dots to a legacy of colonialism. Now, before white folks and settlers came to these lands, it would be, I think, a injustice or too simplified of a picture to imagine that, every queer, gender, or sexually diverse person was like flourishing on these lands. But it is true that it was when white folks and settlers came here that we brought a system of state-sponsored and systemic discrimination that was hostile both to Indigenous communities and hostile to Indigenous expressions of gender and sexual diversity. Different nations had different ways of thinking about and understanding gender and sexuality, and not all of them were perfect. Just like you can imagine that in Europe, some nations were nicer and some were less nice because they're all diverse cultures that are, coming into their own and understanding themselves in different ways. But it was only with the advent and arrival of white folks, of Europeans, of the Brits and the French and the Spanish and the other ones, that we saw the imposition of this state-sponsored system. And so what that tells us is a few things. I think first, it helps us recognize that progress isn't a linear arc, that in many cases, there have been nations and cultures on this land that have been more inclusive, more safe, more liberatory for gender and sexually diverse people than the world and culture that we live in today. And second, it is to understand that part of the colonial process was actually embedding that hostility. Because these agendas, these folks who are trying to gain and maintain power, they aren't just focused on one community. They're focused on controlling how all of us can exist, can live, and who freedom includes or excludes. Does that make sense? And so I come back to this principle of solidarity. And solidarity to me is not just about showing up because we care about those folks over there, or showing up because we think we are gonna, lose out if we allow that first domino to fall and impact another group. It is rather a recognition of shared struggle. I think in 2025, we sometimes have a hard time navigating different experiences through one framework. And what I mean by that is that we imagine, and we've told people for a long time, like if you're not gay, you can have no understanding of what it's like to live in this world as a queer person. If you're not trans, you can have no idea what it's like to live in this world as a trans person. And a nugget of that is indeed true. There are things that I, as a trans gal, will experience that most folks in this room won't. Being scrutinized in women's washrooms, the way that people might hurl insults, the kinds of insults that they might throw my way will be different than the kinds of insults others might experience. But that feeling of a lack of safety when I step out of my house and go to the grocery store is one that women, that racialized folks, that black folks, and many other communities know all too well. And so we can understand and we can empathize. We can see a shared experience, even if we're not imagining that every nuance and intricacy of that experience is identical. And to come together on the belief that no one deserves to be mistreated for who they are, to be shunned and shamed, that no one should be held back by the ways that they are different, is an intersection from which I believe firmly we can build a better world for everybody. Does that make sense? And you're not depressed yet? So to tell you a little bit more about myself, because I love my line in my bio that she was on a chocolate bar and lives rent-free in the rotted brains of the far right. It took me so long to workshop that. Like the notes app on my phone was really like there were 20 different versions. I am the executive director of Queer Momentum. We are a small but scrappy national 2SLGI+ advocacy organization. And we were founded 2.5 years ago with one particular purpose. I've been in the national queer movement for a decade, and when we started to see this regression, actually just a few hours from here in New Brunswick, we noticed a gap in the national ecosystem. We have incredible queer and trans nonprofits in this country. We have organizations like Egal Canada, who are the ones suing Premier Smith and Premier Moe in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and we love them for what they do. And if you ever happen to come across their lawyer, Bennett, he's like this tall. He's adorable. Just give him a hug and say, we have your back and we are so thankful for you. Because he is the man who is in those courtrooms and fighting the good fight for our communities. So we have EGAL, we have local organizations that are there in our community's time of need, that are providing the services and the supports. But what we noticed was the lack of a movement organization. You know, we are not going to get through this era of polarization, of populism with, pretty statements on Instagram. And while services are a critical part of this response and resistance, we need to actually go old school and organize like labor does and used to, like feminists do and used to. We need to get back to some of that old school neighborhood organizing that is actually the approach that has won us most of our rights. And so we founded Momentum to do just that, to be there to support our friends starting in New Brunswick, then in Saskatchewan, then in Alberta, and across this nation, to organize more effectively, to build grassroots power, and to put the resources and tools in place so that when a government rolls back on our rights, we would be ready to make them first pay a political price. And then second, we were ready to go out in their communities, knock on doors, and reach people where they're at. One of the biggest things that we have focused on is the message and response to rising hate. When all of this began, our communities were terrified. And I think we still are. There is this existential doom and gloom and this sense of inevitability. And I feel that every day, this sense that, I am powerless to respond to this staggering rise in hate, and this feeling that no matter what I do, it's not going to go away. But I think that fear and that terror inspired in us a rage and a reactivity that actually isn't the formula to win in an era like this one. When Premier Smith introduced her anti-trans policies that I'll explain briefly, we responded by saying she's a fascist, which I will go toe-to-toe with you about her authoritarian tendencies. And when they started talking about parental rights, we said something that was so righteous, but actually shot us in the foot. They said parental rights, and we said parents don't have rights, they have responsibilities. Now imagine you're a mom who is very confused by our school system. Most of the moms in the room are probably nodding. Have you interacted with the school recently? It's complicated, you're busy, you're scared, and there's a lot going on. But imagine you're a parent who has opened your phone and seen these news articles about gender ideology and they're grooming kids. And you are worried, not because you have this hatred of queer people, but because maybe your value system is different, maybe your beliefs are different, and maybe you don't understand. And then you're seeing people going on TV and saying, you're a bigot, you're a homophobe, you're a transphobe, and we're gonna teach your kids whatever the hell we want, no matter how you feel about it. Do you think as a parent that's gonna win you over? Do you think that's gonna invite you to be part of something bigger, or is it gonna push you down a pipeline that ends in chemtrails? I like the "you got a Saskatchewan" joke. I'm so proud of you. Sorry, Saskatchewan. So I love when I have slides because I just get into the substance of my talk before finishing introducing myself. So I run this lovely, scrappy little queer organization, and we've been trying our best with the resources we have to support the response. We've done a lot of message training, so how do we talk about these issues, which we'll get into. And then we've done a lot of building the advocacy infrastructure so that when bad things happen, you can easily email your MLA, call their office, and cause all kinds of local trouble. In my 10 years of advocacy, I've also been in the unfortunate position of being a public voice, one of a number, for the trans and gender diverse community. What that means is that I have been able to witness, quite personally, the tidal shift. This week is Trans Awareness Week. And I remember when I first tripped out of the closet some 8 or 9 years ago, this week was so damn wholesome. It was so adorable. You would see all these stories about some 16-year-old whose pronouns are confusing, whose hair is blue, and it would just be aw, sweetie little child doing their cute trans thing. And we'd see all these adorable Instagram posts that are this is what a gender is, and this is what a pronoun looks like. That was 7 years ago. Now, every single Trans Awareness Week feels just like every other week. It feels like the world is getting scarier, and I'm going to do everything that I can to make us wake up to the moment that we're in, and I will still feel powerless and like it's not enough to get us out of this moment. The world really did change, and it changed so quickly. We don't see those wholesome, adorable stories anymore. We see the hate articles and the misinformation and the rhetoric that strips away the dignity and the very humanity of vulnerable children. In my job in the last 8 years, I have had right-wing organizations dox my home address, out the hotels that I was staying at. I've had to have security guards guarding me for 7 days 2 years ago because I had my face on a chocolate bar. It wasn't a good chocolate bar, y'all. Like, cookies and cream is not the flavor of choice. I have had my privacy violated. I have had my friends targeted through association with me. When I do particular kinds of events, I have to send guidelines around my safety before I can attend. That sometimes means I need an exit strategy. My last event before this one in Ottawa, I was fortunate enough to receive a famous five, like the gals who gave some of the gals the right to vote. I was lucky enough to receive an Ottawa award in recognition of the famous five. And before the event, some folks who don't like me went around and plastered posters targeting me to try to pressure the organization and organizers to retract the award. Mine is an extreme example, and I think I have become a symbol. There's a reason I say like rent-free in the rotted brains of the far right. Like, they are obsessed with me. I often say that like I would not be as successful as an advocate if they didn't hate everything that I did, because it's really good for social media reach. Like, it's powerful. But my example is, I think, where we're headed and what will become more normal if we don't change and if we don't respond and get back ahead of this rise of hate and vitriol. I think back to the trans folks who came before. I have some of them they're still kicking, and there's some of my friends. And I know from the stories they tell me what the world used to look like. If you came out as trans 50 years ago, you were almost guaranteed to sacrifice your family, your friends, your employment, and you were put into a position where you were understood to be a freak and an outcast. Accessing healthcare was out of reach for most, and you actually had to be subjected to basically like institutionalization and pathologization in order to get the healthcare that you need to live a good life. The trajectory we are on today is eerily familiar to many of our elders in these spaces, because we have indeed been there before. But if we go back 50 years, the climate was different. It was more of a like, we don't talk about those freaks and outcasts over there. What happens when we get back to that space, but instead it's because of a social fixation? Instead, the world now has this image of the scary trans woman or the scary trans person who's gonna assault people in the bathroom, who's gonna invade other folks' spaces, and is gonna yell at you if you say something they disagree with. The trajectory we are on is one that we can avoid, and I'm gonna again get to that shortly, but it requires us seeing our shared humanity. It requires us organizing in our neighborhoods, and it also requires us talking to people that don't speak or think like we do. And that is really the biggest lesson I hope to share today. I love lefty spaces. I was raised in these spaces, despite my parents' efforts. But we've drunk the Kool-Aid. And sometimes we imagine that everyone else has as well. I spend a lot of time in the labor movement. Big shout out to you. Clap for unions. There we go. And unions have range, right? Some of them, they're ready, they know about the transes and they're hyped about us. Others aren't so easy an audience. They're dock workers, they're farmers, they live in a different world than I do. And often when I go on union stages, the audience is scared of me before I'm even on the podium. And I don't think it's because they're like, oh my God, that's a trans person. I think it's because they're expecting somebody to come up and to lecture and condescend and make people feel bad. If we go back to that example of saying parents don't have rights, they have responsibilities, and what emotion that triggers in a parent, do you feel motivated to organize and advocate when people guilt trip you? When people shame you for not knowing the right words? We have embraced a culture of purity and actually of elitism in a lot of our advocacy and organizing. We think that saying the word cis heteronormativity is going to change hearts and minds. I am very happy, as I like to say, to smoke a joint and get into a conversation about the cis heteropatriarchy. Like, I will go to town on that convo, and I will have fun doing it. But I am not going to go on TV and be like, ah, yes, cis heteronormativity. You understand what I'm talking about, right, farmer? I'm in PEI, dock worker or fisherman? You need the contextual examples. But just to paint the picture again, my last bit of demoralizing, depressing component is to just look at what's happening and how our opposition is using anti-trans hate as a scapegoat and a vehicle to weaken democracy, to remove checks and balances on government power, and to actually take back control of our social and cultural ecosystems, to re-fight the battles we already won, which were the battles to give Indigenous folks, racialized folks, women, gays and theys of all sorts, the ability to live their lives. If we look again in Alberta, you have a government that is putting a politician in your family doctor's office, looking over a mom's shoulder and denying her family the healthcare that they need. Now that is about trans people, but imagine what precedent that sets. You know, we're in an era where COVID conspiracy, where bodily autonomy are under assault, or where COVID conspiracy is rising and bodily autonomy are under assault. If a government is able to, step into that politician, or into that family doctor's office and say, I know better than your family doctor does. I know better than the medical authority, than the medical association. I'm going to ban this type of care because I don't think it's the right kind of care for you. Which kind of health care do you think they're coming for next? Access to reproductive health services. But I don't believe it will end there. The precedent of state encroachment in the private lives of its citizens and the violation of the sacrosanct relationship between a physician and their patients is a precedent that will ruin the integrity and the trust in institutions that Canadians depend upon. That is what is happening in Alberta through attacks on gender-affirming care. We also see efforts to ban trans young people's capacity to be themselves at school. Because legacies and generations of homophobia weren't enough, they decided that since some kids could use different names and pronouns, we need to double down and strip that right away. Now, it's important, again, how we talk about these issues. This is actually not governments forcing kids out of the closet. That's not the issue at stake. What is at stake is the ability for kids to come out of that closet to begin with. Now, it's important that we respect and honor parents in this conversation. So the detail of the policy in Alberta and Saskatchewan is that if you are 16 or under, you need parental permission to change your name and pronouns at school. Now, a lot of parents have instinctively aligned with that because the right wing used the language of parental rights. And that's really brilliant language. That is a dog whistle, but it's one that's hard to unpack because, again, you can't just say you don't have rights. That doesn't win anyone's hearts and minds over. It also put us in the position where it looked like we didn't love and care about parents. And so to be clear, first, we are in a country where the overwhelming majority of parents, even if they don't get it perfectly, will support their kid if they happen to come out as trans. And that is important to recognize. Second, we are actually the biggest advocates for more parental engagement in our education system because we want parents engaged in their child's education because healthy parents, happy families lead to the best, most healthy, and ready to cope with the world children. We are not here to have teachers keeping secrets from kids. We are here to give those young trans people the freedom to come out on their terms when they are ready to do so. Just like gays have for generations, we come out to our friends and our teachers before we come out to our families, not because we don't trust our families, but because even in the best situation, it's a really scary, vulnerable conversation. And a positive reaction is never a guarantee. What Alberta and Saskatchewan have done is strip that nuance away and also take away that window where kids could explore themselves. And more than that, it is given that same permission in an era where Andrew Tate and Joe Rogan are poisoning the ecosystem with hate and lies. It is given permission to that playground bully. But it's interesting as well because it's about trans people and about trans kids. But the policies actually don't stop there. For generations, women, progressives, and a lot of others fought to get sex ed into our schools. Because we know that without sex ed, rates of gender-based violence will continue to rise. Boys will be poisoned by the manosphere and the far-right ecosystem, and they will mistreat their female classmates. And without education on healthy relationships, on gender-based violence, on sex and sexuality and diverse families, we will see us lose the culture war at a faster and faster rate. If you want to learn about your own body in Alberta right now, you need written permission from your parents first. Now again, I want parents to be involved in the education system. I also believe that parents deserve to be able to raise their kids in alignment with their values. That is critical. If your faith is different from mine, that is okay. And I would love for your version of your faith to be as inclusive as possible. But my job is actually not to tell you how to think or what to believe. My belief, however, is that schools are meant to provide a counter note to personal opinion. They're supposed to raise kids so that they understand the evidence, so they have the knowledge to make their own decisions. And we need to strike that balance in better ways. Now, deeper beneath the anti-trans policies themselves are the efforts by conservative governments in particular to normalize the invocation of the notwithstanding clause. Raise your hand if you know what the notwithstanding clause is. This is better than I expected. The notwithstanding clause is baked into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The charter was passed, I don't remember the year, but somebody here definitely does, and some of you were probably alive for it because of the average age in PEI. I make different jokes in different communities, and they're always riffing off of their culture. You should see what I talked about. I went to the Yukon once, and I joked that it's really hard to spot the lesbians in the north. The lesbians in the north loved that joke. Notwithstanding clause. Charter. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is, in essence, what halts government intervention and violation of the rights and freedoms of civilians. It stops state overreach into our private lives, and that is a critical check on government power. The notwithstanding clause is a legal avenue. It was brought in, it was a part of the charter to begin with, and so governments have every right to use this clause. But what has happened in recent years is they've begun using it preemptively. So in Saskatchewan, I was hanging out with my buddy, my boy Bennett, who's the lawyer at EGAL, and I was with him when we got the best news. After Premier Scott Moe introduced his anti-trans policy, they took it to court, and a judge passed an injunction. An injunction, in essence, halts the implementation of the policy until a ruling by the court. It doesn't mean that they can't do it down the road, but the court is going to determine if it is in compliance with charter-protected rights. That was a huge win. I was dancing. We were giddy. We had halted the restriction of the rights of trans kids in Saskatchewan. And then 20 goddamn minutes later, we all get a news alert. Premier Moe has recalled the legislature, and he's passing the Parental Bill of Rights to suspend and invoke the notwithstanding clause to suspend the charter-protected rights of Saskatchewan children. Now, I grew up in a military family. My parents voted for Harper the first time. My dad the second time. And I always heard that conservatives were the ones who respect the rule of law, who believe in the integrity of our institutions and want to uphold those institutions. Imagine what it says about a government that they are so scared of our court system, that they are so terrified of the public understanding what the actual implications of their policies are, that they, instead of making their case in court and standing their ground because they believe they are right, they strip away the rights of those kids and circumvent our legal system. On Monday, in 2 days, we are expecting Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta to invoke that same notwithstanding clause again. Now, to connect dots, because it is important to understand that this is not just about trans people, we're a convenient target. They also invoked the notwithstanding clause to force teachers in Alberta back to work a hot second ago. I don't think they would have been able to get away with that if Scott Moe had leaned in and further normalized the use of that clause. What happens to our rights when governments can take them away and the citizens do not respond. We do not have rights if we do not rally to defend and uphold them. I believe that there may be a situation at some point where a government legitimately needs to invoke the notwithstanding clause. I can't imagine that scenario, but I understand the importance of the people's supremacy over the court system, because we live in a democracy, and that is integral. But the flippant, irresponsible use of the notwithstanding clause threatens the very institutions that keep us safe. And that is the trajectory we are now headed towards. The notwithstanding clause doesn't just apply to queer and trans people. It applies to newcomers, to women, to migrants, racialized communities, and to workers. That is the majority of people on this land. And they are now making it normal to be able to circumvent their charter-protected rights and freedoms. I like to do a what is that? Or, no, what was my word? There was a word, it ran away. And so what I want us to understand in the broad strokes is that this is indeed an attack on trans people. It is an effort to take our rights away and all that good stuff. But it is a war for the soul of our society. It is a battle where they want to retake all that social and cultural power that they lost over the last 50 years of progressive organizing. They want us to no longer trust our neighbors and to no longer see shared humanity across the street. I dream of a Canada that is what we talk about when most of us describe this nation. And it is, God, it's flawed. And God, it is still and has always been violent. But the Canada that I dream of is one where freedom includes everyone, including people who don't look, live, and love like you do. The Canada I believe in is one where, when our neighbors are having a hard time, we lift them up and we show up to support them. Because I actually believe that as a defining identity is one of the most beautiful, incredible, and unique traits one can possibly imagine. I dream of a Canada that is all that we say we want to be and all the very best that we aspire to. And so the strategy of our opposition is to divide and conquer our communities. As conservative governments, and maybe some liberal ones, and maybe some others, struggle to deal with the housing crisis, struggle to deal with healthcare, as they struggle to tackle the cost of living, as they fail to deliver on the priorities that citizens care about, it is easy to distract and divide by picking culture war battles, by coming for and scapegoating our newcomer neighbors. And that is exactly what we're seeing both our federal government and conservative politicians across this country do. They are trying to make you blame migrants, immigrants, and newcomers for a crisis that these governments orchestrated. They're using the same strategy that they're using against trans people, against migrant and newcomer communities. And so in response, we can't just pretend that's an issue over there. We need to show up for and with those neighbors too. Just like when we see a government legislate back to work our flight attendants. And Mark Hancock, the president of CUPE, who is an icon and a national treasure in my opinion, there's nothing more incredible than watching him rip up the back to work order and say, hell no, you are not forcing my workers back. And so the challenge is, we are so good at solidarity when it comes to Instagram posts. And we're so good at the hot takes, but we are not necessarily good at showing up in community, at having hard conversations, and building coalitions to unite our movements in an era of division and polarization. We are losing the culture war battle, but we don't have to be. We win when we recognize it is not just about one identity, but it is about our shared values and our shared vision for a world that works better for every single person on this land. My invitation at its core is for us to have that conversation with the dude bro at the dive bar. To chat with that neighbor who uses the wrong language and is maybe scared of those trans people. And to understand that most people are not raging homophobes or bigots. That most people are scared in a world that is a hell of a lot more complicated and indeed diverse than they are probably used to. And they are trying to do their best in a hellscape of a situation. I do not blame the dock worker, the fisherman, or the farmer for not understanding what a trans person is, for not knowing what pronouns are, and for maybe laughing at us a little bit. I like to laugh at us too. I understand that farmer is having a hard time paying his bills, that he didn't grow up in a big city with a gender studies major. I understand that I need my movement to be a place where he feels welcome, because if I have him on board, I have an ambassador to all of the other farmers who are in that same situation. And so my invitation is to course correct the purity culture that we have embraced, and to be the cool, fun, I was gonna say sexy movement that we can and should be. We are ready to have conversations across difference. We see that most people love their neighbors and believe in that better future, and that we can have dialogue with them to bring them into this tent and into this struggle with us. What I worry about is the trajectory we're on and the speed with which it is accelerating. And so I only have 5 minutes left, which is very scary. Probably 4 minutes at this point. When I think about, how we get back on track from here, I think we need to simplify our ideas. I think we need to stop doing the thing that feels right and doing the work that wins. Our instinctive response is not an effective response. Reacting out of anger and rage and hurt, oh boy, it feels good sometimes. But if we can have caring compassion in those moments, we can bring so many more folks along with us. The opposition's narrative about our movements right now is indeed that we're going to yell at them, we're going to shame them, we're going to use guilt as a weapon and as a cudgel, and if you don't drink the Kool-Aid, we are going to make you into an outcast. Now, I know that's not who we really are. That's not reflective of our actual beliefs, but I think we can accidentally fall prey to it, because that righteousness feels really good. It feels really powerful, especially when you're part of a community that for generations has felt powerless. And so I hate to say that I don't care, but I don't care, because my mission is to make sure that our community still has rights tomorrow. And I will do anything and everything to get us to that point. I have seen the price that my elders paid to advocate and organize for the rights I now enjoy. They are incredible people, but I also see the scars and the wounds. I've been in this work for 10 years, and I am too stubborn for my own good. But I also know that it is going to cost, and has already costed me. It costs me in my sense of safety, but it also costs me in terms of my sense of, how do I say it nicely? I'm going to say instead that every generation before us had to become hardened against the hate. It was so normal that they had to become strong and brush it off. Mine, especially on the trans side, mine was the first generation that said, hell no, we deserve better. And we're going to set that bar. Everyone knew they deserved better, but we said the world should be here, and we're going to walk in this world like it already is. Well, the world isn't here. And if you imagine that it's going to treat you like this, every interaction of icky and bad is going to hurt all the much more. What I want us to organize is for the world that is just 2 years down the road. And that's one that's a bit better than this one. It's not utopia, but we build that utopia by bringing everyone along with us in that struggle. I believe that we organize to win by envisioning a better future for all of our families. That is one where families have the healthcare and childcare that they need, good jobs, where we maintain the integrity of our systems and have checks and balances on government power. I believe that the world is headed towards a global showdown. It's going to be democracy and freedom versus authoritarianism and fascism. That is the trajectory we are on. That is what we're seeing south of the border. And we will not win if we play into the polarization game. But guess what? They do it better than we do. They don't care about nuance and human rights. They will pit community against community. And unless we are the ones who are organizing with love, with defiance, and with hope, they will win. The right thrives on fear and anger. The reason they have been losing is because we knew that hope and hard work, to quote Jack Layton, love and a belief in shared humanity can overcome everything they throw our way. And so in the name of the 15-year-old trans kid who deserves to grow up in a safe community and to be able to grow up without being hardened, like so many generations have been. We need to lean in and organize. In the name of the newcomers that deserve to be welcomed here, of the queer and trans refugees who are fleeing contexts of violence and oppression, in the name of that worker who has worked and worked and worked and still can't make ends meet and is scared to put food on the table for their family, we gotta lean in because we are stronger together. And while they might be kicking ass right now on the far right, we can organize to win because our ideas are better, our values are better, and we're so much prettier than they are. It's been an honor, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And just 1 minute.